Hi there, my name is Sonia with So On and So Forth. Today I am going to be sewing up this beautiful coffee and tea cardigan from Annelaine Patterns. And I wanted to show you how I French seam my seams. And French seaming provides a really nice finish. At the moment, I don't have a serger. And so with this fabric, it's a knit fabric. And I don't want any of the raw edges to show on the inside of my cardigan. So I'm going to show you how to French seam, which basically just encloses the raw seams. And so I'm going to go ahead and take you along while I sew up this cardigan and show you how I French seam. So at this time, I have my right sides together on this cardigan. So I have the back side, which is here, and the front two pieces. Now, when you're French seaming, it's going to be pretty much you're going to start out pretty much the opposite of what the instructions usually say for a seam. So when you normally follow the instructions on a pattern, it'll say sew the shoulders right sides together. So what you're going to do with French seaming, you're going to start off with the wrong sides together. And so what I'm going to do is, I don't know if you can see or not, but on this fabric, the right side and the wrong side look really similar, but this one has a real shiny side. So I'm using the shiny side as my front side. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it to where my wrong sides of my fabric are together, because the first step in this pattern is going to be to sew the shoulder seams together. And I'm going to go ahead and pin it at the shoulder seams. I'm a pinner, so I use lots of pins. You can also use clips. This fabric is really, really thin, which is going to be perfect for transition from our summer here in Southwest Missouri to fall, because some of the days here are still in the 80s. Okay, so I'm going to take the second piece here. So this is the right side here. I'm going to flip it to the wrong side of the back piece. And again, it's going to be pretty much to start off with opposites. So wrong side to wrong side. Then I'm going to go ahead and sew at the shoulders, and I'll be right back for the next step. So as you can see, I have gone ahead and stitched wrong sides together to create my first seam in my French seams. Now, a couple things I want to mention is that this pattern calls for pretty narrow seams at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so I did, for this particular tip, I cut my seams a little bit bigger, just maybe by 1/8 or 1/4 inch when I cut out my pattern. Just because when you're encasing the raw seams, you want to allow for a little bit more space. So here, let me get my ruler. I did about 1/8 of an inch. You could barely even see about 1/8 of an inch. Normally I French seam My first seam is 1/4 of an inch, but because I didn't want to get too much in to the seam allowance anymore, because I didn't want to take the risk of my garment not fitting, I only did about 1/8 of an inch. So normally what you would do is you would have enough seam allowance here to where you would actually cut off this raw edge, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it just for this case. But normally you want to cut off this raw edge as close to the seam, of course, without cutting your stitches. So the next step, because French seaming is pretty much a 2-step process, is that you're going to flip this so you can see where this seam is. There's no raw edges here. You're going to flip this over. So now your fabric is the way that it's normally intended to be sewn, right sides together. So I don't know if you can see the shininess, but this is the right side. This right here is the right side. So again, I'm going to pin, because this fabric is very, very slippery. I'm going to go ahead and pin. Then I'm going to encase this raw edge. If you can see that here, this is the raw edge. So I'm going to encase that, and I'm going to go ahead and use 1/4 inch seam allowance. At this point, whatever seam allowance you use, for instance, if you had a 5/8 seam allowance and your original French seam, the first step to your French seam, you used 1/4 inch, you would just go ahead and do the rest of your seam allowance from the 5/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch. But because this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance according to the pattern, I'm going to go ahead and use 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And again, remember, I did cut my seams just a little bit bigger because I didn't want to take the chance of the garment not fitting. So that's just the way I do it, and it works for me. When you're just starting out with French seams, and depending on the pattern, what the seam allowances call for, you're just going to have to try it out and see what works for you. So I'm going to go ahead and finish pinning this. I'm going to do my seam allowance at 1/4 inch, sew this up, and I'll be right back. I have just finished the second step in the French seaming process. So this is the inside of the shoulder seams of this Coffee and Tea cardigan. Just going to snip my threads here. I like to snip as I go. And so you can see this is going to be the inside of my cardigan. And this is going to be the outside of my cardigan. So this is the outside of my cardigan. You can see there are no raw edges. And when you don't have a serger, this is really helpful. So I hope this tip helped you. I'm going to go ahead and finish sewing my beautiful cardigan. I cannot wait till it's done. And the next step in this pattern is the sleeves. The next step in sewing this cardigan is the sleeves. And I am also going to be French seaming the sleeves, but I thought I would show this process as well because it may seem a little bit confusing. So with the sleeves, the pattern says, again, to sew the right sides together. So I have placed the right sides together just so I can show you and how my process goes, so I don't get myself confused while I am doing this. So there are 2 sets of notches on the sleeves. The 2 notches indicate the back, so you match up the back with the back. And 1 notch represents the front, so you'll match up the front with the front. Now, for French seaming, again, we're going to do wrong sides together. So right now I have right sides together. I'm just going to take this sleeve and move it to the back. That way I don't get confused. And again, I'm going to pin, match my notches, and sew, using the very narrow seam allowance to get me started with my first raw edge of my French seam. I'm going to go ahead and sew these together and I'll come back. So I have finished French seaming the next step, which was the sleeves. And this is the right side of the cardigan here. And you can see that the raw edges are encased, but there's nothing poking through. So you don't want any of your raw edges poking through. And then you have no raw edges on the inside. So the sleeves are nicely set as well. No raw edges. This is the shoulder seam here. I'm going to go ahead and finish sewing up this cardigan. I hope this tutorial was helpful and that you will try the French seams on your next cardigan from Annelaine Patterns. Please be sure to check out the Annelaine Patterns website along with the Mama Can Do It Patterns website. I have listed the website information and discount codes for you.